Hi, my name is David Kelsey, and today we'll be discussing Lecture 11 on the syllogism in my critical thinking course. So, a syllogism is a two-premise deductive argument. And these types of arguments first are deductive. So, if you remember, the deductive arguments are the ones that are meant to be valid, right? And so with deductive arguments, we have a kind of necessary connection between the premises and conclusion of the argument. All right, and the second criteria of syllogisms is that they have only two premises. So, although you might have deductive arguments with many premises, syllogisms just have two, right? So I have a couple examples for you. The first is about Socrates, the philosopher. So Socrates is a man, premise one. All men are mortal, premise two. And so therefore, the conclusion of the argument, of course, is that Socrates is mortal, right? And you can see that that conclusion follows necessarily from the premises, and it is deductive in that case then. And so we have there a syllogism. Our next example is a bit, kind of absurd, I think, but nevertheless, it's valid and deductively so. It's premise one is that the moon is made of green cheese, and then two, something's made of green cheese that orbits the earth, and so therefore three, the moon orbits the earth. All right, and so again, that conclusion has to follow from the premises, and so that's a deductive argument, also has two premises, which makes it a syllogism. Okay, so the kind of arguments we'll be looking at today are going to all be syllogisms in that sense. They're all going to be deductively valid arguments. Well, we'll see if they are valid or not, but they'll have two premises and they'll be deductive arguments. So, okay. Now, in particular, what we say in our logic is that not just that we deal with syllogisms, but syllogisms of a particular type, right? And so our logic, I like to say that the scope of our logic is just this one type of argument, and it's just this one particular type of syllogism. Okay, and if you remember, a syllogism is two premises and it's deductive, but our logic in particular focuses on syllogisms that are categorical. Okay, so this is a particular type of syllogism. All right, so the first thing about a categorical syllogism is that it's a syllogism, of course, a two-premise deductive argument. But secondly, right, the three claims in the argument, right? Remember, the syllogism has two premises and a conclusion. All three of those claims there are all standard form categorical claims. So they're all A, E, I, or O standard form categorical claims, right? If you remember, for example, the A claim, it says all blanks are blank. For example, all tigers are mammals, right? So all of our claims, right, our two premises and our conclusion in this type of argument, this categorical syllogism, must be of that type, that form, right, a standard form categorical claim. So, okay, the last rule that we have to apply with categorical syllogisms is that in the categorical syllogism as a whole, you can only have three terms. Okay, and what I mean by this, right, if you remember that with a standard form categorical claim, there are two terms, right? So, for example, in the claim, all tigers are mammals, you have two terms, tigers and mammals there, right? So the point is, with the categorical syllogism, the entire argument shares only three terms, right? So the idea is that each of these three terms will be shared between two of the argument's claims. So, for example, you might have a term that occurs in the first premise and also the conclusion, right? The last kind of point here is that these three terms, none of them can occur in the same claim, right? So I couldn't have all tigers or tigers, for example. The terms, the three of them, each need to occur in two different claims of the argument. And that way, the three terms are they fill up all the term places for the categorical syllogism. All right, hope that makes sense. So anyway, kind of back to it. The point here is that our logic, again, the scope of it is these types of arguments, right? And in the end, what we're going to be learning is a system to evaluate the validity of such arguments, right? So you have these kind of categorical syllogisms, and then we'll basically have a system which can test those categorical syllogisms to determine whether they're valid or invalid, right? And that's kind of the end game here that we're working toward. So, okay, so again the categorical syllogisms have three and only three terms, okay? And so these three terms will all have a specific name, all right? So the first is what we call the major term. The major term is very specifically the term, whatever term it is, that occurs as the predicate of the conclusion of the argument, right? The predicate term of the conclusion of the argument. So the predicate term, remember, is the second placeholder in a standard form categorical claim. It's that second term that occurs right at the end of the claim. And so whatever occurs there in the conclusion of the argument is what we call the major term. The minor term then is whatever term occurs as the subject of the conclusion. Okay, and so that's going to be the minor term. It's just going to be the subject of the conclusion, right? And then lastly, we have what's called the middle term. The middle term is the term that occurs in both of the premises, but not the conclusion. So there's always going to be a middle term, a term that just, in a sense, shared between the premises. Okay? So we have here a kind of, not a quiz or something, but a bit of test your skills. So we have three arguments, and we want to determine if any of these are categorical syllogisms and why, or why not, right? So the first example, it says all cats are mammals. Then, the first premise says all cats are mammals. Then the second premise says not all cats are domestic. And then the conclusion of the argument is therefore not all mammals are domestic, right? So we have all cats are mammals, not all cats are domestic, therefore not all mammals are domestic. That's the first example. Now, if you think about this example and kind of the requirements for something to be a categorical syllogism, this actually fails that at least one of those requirements, in fact, two of them. So the first requirement it fails is about the terms, right? So, right, if you remember, there's supposed to only be three terms that are shared among the argument here, right? We have the major, the minor, and the middle term. And you notice here that the middle term seems to be cats, right? That is the term that occurs in both premises, right? All cats are mammals and not all cats are domestic. So cats is occurring in both of the premises. And then you have the minor term, which is the subject of the conclusion, and that appears to be mammals, right? Mammals is occurring as the predicate of the first premise and the subject of the conclusion, it looks like, right? Okay, so lastly, if you look at, again, the term domestic here, we have, the major term here, which is domestic. It occurs as the predicate of the conclusion of the argument, also occurs as the predicate of what seems to be the second premise. But the problem with domestic, if you remember, it is not a proper term because it's an adjective. And if you remember, terms need to be nouns or noun phrases. Adjectives don't qualify. So for that one to count, it'd have to be something like domestic animals or something, right? So that is problem number one. So it doesn't count as a categorical syllogism because essentially the second premise and the conclusion aren't standard form categorical claims because their terms aren't, how they're supposed to be, right? Secondly, though, if you notice that the second premise and the conclusion are not standard form categorical claims because they aren't an A, E, I, or O claim, right? They begin with not all, right? And none of our standard form categorical claims begin like that. In fact, you can have an E claim that would be no, for example, no cats are domestic, right? Or no mammals are domestic. Or you could have an A claim which would be all cats are domestic or all mammals are domestic, but you don't have a not all that qualifies as an A, E, I, or O. So again, this argument is not a categorical syllogism because the second premise and the conclusion are not standard form categorical claims, right? Let's move to the next example then. The first premise says some voters are not students, and then the second premise says all voters are local people, and the conclusion says therefore some local people are non-students, right? Now, to kind of test whether it's a categorical syllogism or not, what I tend to do is I tend to look for first what type of claims we're dealing with, and then secondly what the terms are. So first, it looks like in our first premise there, some voters are not students, we have an O claim, right? Then secondly, the second premise, all voters are local people, is an A claim. And then lastly, the conclusion, some local people are non-students, appears to be a kind of I claim, right? So it looks like we might be okay. We have an O, an A, and an I claim. Now, second though, let's try to test whether or not the premises count, or sorry, the terms count, right? So our terms are, it looks to be voters, students, local people, and non-students. You can see there that there's a difference between the term students and non-students. In fact, those aren't the same term at all, right? And so what we have with this this example here is actually 4 terms, right? And if you remember, a categorical syllogism can only have 3, right? Our 4 terms here are voters, students, local people, and non-students. And so this example is just not going to qualify as a categorical syllogism for that reason. Okay. Now our last example we're going to look at, it goes like this, right? First premise, it says all soccer players are athletes. The second premise says some basketball players are athletes, and so therefore the conclusion, some soccer players are not basketball players. Okay. So here our first premise is an A claim. Our second is an I, and our conclusion looks to be an O claim, right? Some soccer players are not basketball players. Okay, so we have an A, an I, and an O. So that looks good, right? Now what about the terms? So the major term here appears to be basketball players. That occurs as the predicate of the conclusion and also as the subject of the second premise, right? And then you have the minor term being soccer players, which occurs, of course, as the subject of the conclusion, but also as the subject of the first premise. Lastly, we have the term athletes. And athletes is what we would call the middle term. It occurs as the predicate of both premises. And so it looks like what we have here is 3 terms, and we have also an A, an I, and an O claim as our, our 3 claims in the argument. And it looks like also we have a deductive 2-premise argument. And so it looks like we have a good categorical syllogism. That one is going to qualify. So that being said, that is the type of argument we're going to be looking at sort of for the rest of our lesson on categorical logic, right? And then what we'll see next in our next lesson is just how to check those types of arguments, like that one about the soccer players and the athletes and the basketball players. We're going to learn how to check those arguments to see if they're valid or invalid, because there will be some that aren't always, they're not always going to be valid, right? Some won't be. So, okay, well, I hope you enjoyed the lesson today on categorical logic and in particular categorical syllogisms. Next, we'll be looking at trying to evaluate those guys for validity or not. All right, have a good one.